Okay. As you can see, the agenda is up there on the board, and what we're going to be doing today is take attendance. If for some reason I ever forget to take attendance, please, I need somebody to remind me, because if anybody becomes sick, then we need to know the attendance for tracing. All right. Then we're going to, it sounds like you don't have any questions, and I've not really received any questions other than one email asking about the private self-introduction. So that is out there, posted in Moodle now, and I also sent it to everybody in your SEC email. Please be sure to read your SEC emails, because that will keep you very updated on reminders and things like that. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about some upcoming assignments. I always like to get some reminders out there. And then the bulk of today is really going to be our first real lecture. So you've already been through the orientation. Hopefully everybody who has attended the other session have also listened to the orientation, so you know what is expected. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of course content. All right, so we're going to do that by talking about first what is self-talk, and then moving into looking at IPC specifically. Then we're going to learn 3 different communication models that are utilized to explain what are known as the processes of communications. And I'm going to give you a lecture specifically covering textbook 1.1 and 1.2 with summarizing a few key takeaways. You will probably want to open up your textbooks to follow along if you like. We're going to go by 1.1 and 1.2 rather than page numbers because it's an HTML and that's going to be easier for you to follow along. So we're actually going to begin with 1.1. All right, so attendance. I need you to shout out here or present so I know you're here. Adams. Ethan Adams. Adams. Berger. Cagle. Collins. Mann. McNeil. Monroe. Is anybody there? How about Sandoval? Okay, so I must have the wrong class. You guys are here for interpersonal communication, right? Right. And you are in section A, correct? That meets on Mondays and Wednesdays? Oh, no, you're O2. Silly me. It's my bad. Sorry, I'm still figuring out everything. Let me try again. Bell. Is Bell there? Last name? Okay, let me try another way. All right, so let me go into here. Could you tell me, are you in section 120 H01 or H02?
H01B.
H01B. All right. Edwards? So Edwards is here? Okay. Now I got it. Paxton? Here. Perry? Here. Slusser? Here. Staten? Or Staten? Taglis? Here. Vickers? And Zepeda?
Here. Could it have been Vickers by any chance?
I'm sorry?
Could it have been Vickers by any chance? Because that's me.
Could you spell it for me?
Vickers?
Yes. Okay, I got you. Thank you. Anybody else's name I did not call? All right, you guys are awesome. We figured it out. Yay! Okay, yeah, you are a small group. Okay. All right. Okay. So now that attendance is out of the way, you all should have looked at your schedule of assignments as well as your syllabus by now. And when we look at the schedule of assignments, hopefully you can pull this out up on your laptop if you like, you'll see that your first quiz is due August 26th. That is to confirm your enrollment in the course. Remember to do that or otherwise you will be dropped. September 2nd is orientation quiz number 2. That really is important to have listened to the video. Some of the things I went over last class as well, or actually the videos. So make sure that you know exactly what the course expectations are so that you can earn that grade in the class, all right? I encourage you to start working on Module 1 assignments. And again, self-intros were sent to you in an assignment, in an email. So just download those, fill them out, and return them to me in an email, and I will provide any resources or help that you need. All right? All right, good. All right, so what I want to do is I want to talk about first a concept called intrapersonal communication. Many of you know that as self-talk. So intra, T-R-A, personal communication. All communication begins there. It may be conscious or subconscious, but it always begins with yourself. So that's why this class I mentioned at the beginning is so powerful, because it really is all about you. And next class we will begin to take a look at, or maybe even at the end of this one, we'll begin to take a look at what are your drives, what are your needs, what are your desires that actually motivate communication to occur. But they have to start with yourself. And the ability to articulate in your brain what it is you need or what you want, etc., is vitally important for understanding communication. And that oftentimes gets into the biology of communication. So to start off, recognize that the study of communication studies, is informed. We gather data and research from lots of different sources, all right? So, biology, psychology, very important. Sociology. We also look at anthropology and cultural studies and women's studies and critical studies. And those kinds of things. We also, even more and more recently, are getting into media studies and even technology specifically computers. So as we begin to explore into the new realms of artificial intelligence, this is all going to play a role in it, as well as the next part I'll talk about. The list goes on and on. What's interesting is that up until about 60 years ago, most communication courses were called speech, and they were a subset of English courses, or under the English department realm. We still, at this college, have it, in the state of North Carolina, have it under English and humanities. But where I come from in California, communication studies is actually under social sciences, right? So a lot depends on the leaning of the discipline and of the university or the community college, etc. And my background is specifically in my graduate studies on leadership development, senior executive leadership development, and organizational communication. So that also is going to drive a little bit of the perspective that I bring into this class. So all of these things go into trying to understand self-talk. How do you talk to yourself? How do you talk about yourself, to yourself, as well as to others? All right, so that's why I say there's a lot of conscious and unconscious stuff going on. What is acceptable to say and what is not acceptable to say, so taboos according to sociology, cultural studies, where you're from, etc. So all of this stuff is going to come into play. Okay, so it's a very, I forgot to write English, and even philosophy, especially when we get into ethics and what is authentic and what is true. All of these things come in to explain what the study of communications are, which is why it's such a fascinating degree. My goal is always to have at least one student from my classes be converted to want to get a degree in communication studies, because you see how rich it is and that it will open so many occupational career doors for you. All right, or a minor, at least, in communication studies. Okay, so understand we have intrapersonal communication. So that's one of the first terms. Okay, that means our self-talk. How do we talk to ourselves and about ourselves? And then the next term that is a building block or understanding conceptually of what this course is about is exactly interpersonal communication, ER, as opposed to RA. So the interpersonal communication is how you commute primarily one-to-one. Now I want you to notice the phrase I use, one-to-one. Some people you will hear use the phrase one-on-one. We don't use that phrase anymore in communication studies because that, by very nature of the word on versus to, indicates power, one over another, on top of, above, etc. So in communication studies, in the here and now, is really saying, nope, we want to look at how do we communicate with another person. Now, primarily, it's going to be one person and one person, you and one other person. That significant other, that instructor, that classmate, that supervisor at work, etc. Occasionally, it might go up to two, but not as often, all right? Because once you start to get into two, and especially into three, that goes into a whole new realm of communication studies, which is called small group communication. right? So we have lots of different types of communication. So already you've learned intrapersonal. You have learned interpersonal communication. You've also started to learn small group communication. Now, those of you who have taken public speaking, you then know that there is public speaking, and that's going to be to lots and lots of people. We also have CM, which is computer mediated, okay, or mediated communication, which simply means that there is technology being involved. So right now we are using mediated communication because we have another media brought into it versus just face-to-face. Another type of communication under this umbrella of studies is what I said is organizational. And if any of you are getting a degree in business or looking at business psychology, this organizational comm is very aligned with what we call behavioral, organizational behavior. This, excuse me, this is specifically with a psychology degree, and this is with a communication degree. And that's my background. That's where I come from. This is organizational culture. This is how people interact within a business entity or within a classroom. This is their norms. This is what's acceptable, their taboos. How do people get ahead, etc. And we're going to talk a lot about culture in a little bit. All right, and then there's more. There is a new science out there, which is actually called extrapersonal. And extrapersonal is taking on a couple of different avenues. Extrapersonal could be like out of the Earth hemisphere. So, like, are there beings out there in outer space? And many of us think there are, so there might be that. Some people talk about this as referring to communion with spirits, the afterlife, saints, God, whoever or whatever God is to you. So some are looking at this as how do you have a personal conversation relationship with somebody who is otherworldly, kind of thing. And then there is also included in this a lot of communication studies with animal behaviors. So yes, your dogs know what you're saying, and they recognize the tone of your voice, your nonverbals, etc., as well as many, many other animals. So communication is fascinating, and so hopefully you're starting to see that a little bit. Okay, so those are some of our terms to give us an overview of this world. Now, let's dive into your textbook. And in your textbook, under 1.1, it talks about intrapersonal communication, which I've just gone over. And you can think of it as the term they use called internal vocalization, how you are vocalizing your thoughts only internally inside your brain. And then it goes into interpersonal communication, and which is what I just went through. So kind of think about it as, what is it that you want to get out of this class personally? What are some goals that you want to achieve in your specific relationships when you are speaking one-to-one with people, customers, bosses, parents, children. The list goes on, and you can kind of decide, because remember, you are self-directing your focus, because as I illustrated, this is such a huge kind of phenomenon, this thing called courses, that you're going to need to be able to do that. All right, so let's jump over to 1.2. 1.2. Now again, for any of you who are going to get a degree in communication, this is now foundational. You have to know this before you can go to any other communication level. And what we're going to do is talk about 3 primary models. Now, a model is just a way of creating a visual to explain things that you cannot see. All right, or things that interact in a way that's a little bit difficult to try and figure out how it works. So I'm going to draw some pictures. Actually, I'm going to draw one great big picture, and I'm going to start off with one model, add to it, etc., and end with one great big model. All right, and this enables you to see what are the components. So there is figure 1.1. So if everybody will look at figure 1.1 in your textbook. We're going to do happy faces, but you all know that not all communication is happy, but we're going to start there. All right, and we're going to put it together by recognizing the point of beginning and then the receiver. And we use that by using the word sender, because somebody's going to have a message that they want to send. That means that it's going to be received. So this is our receiver. All right? Pretty elementary, I know, but just deal with me, because this is the language that we use. All right. So the sender has a message that wants to be sent. It could be a feeling or a thought. Now, basically, all communication is grounded in those 2 spheres. Is what you're feeling or what you're thinking. Again, conscious or not. All right? So the sender first has to do what's called encode. All right? That feeling or that thought. So what happens is everybody has a code, and code is the language. There's nonverbal language as well as verbal language. There is English language and there is Arabic language. There is text written language, and there are numbers written language. All right, all of those are codes. Okay? And what we have to do is to put those feelings and those thoughts into some type of a code that we think the receiver is going to know. If the receiver doesn't know it, what we have here is a failure to communicate. So there's lots of different stuff we'll call in a moment, but for right now, just recognize that I am going to create a message based on putting letters or words or numbers or hand gestures or whatever it is together to send a message, right? So that then is the message, okay? The message is going to be along a channel. Anybody want to guess what are the different channels that we're using in today's world? Anybody? Just pull down your little mask and shout it out and then put your mask back up. No, you just want to observe. Okay, that's all right. We can do that. Okay, so the channels. Well, this is a channel, the cell phone. Okay, the cell phone. The computer is a channel. Um, words spoken face to face with somebody. A channel might be over a television or a computer screen. It might be the radio. Okay, those are what we call channels, a way of getting the message through wires or sound or a room or what have you. All right, and that's going to be important in a moment to keep in mind. Then the receiver is going to take that code, all right, that came through whatever channel was determined to be the best, and is then going to decode the message. And this is where all hell breaks loose. And the reason is because there is going to be, and you can see it on your little diagram here, what we call noise. And I actually like to do it this way. Noise. Noise, oh my gosh, there are so many types of noise out there. When we look at noise, we're going to see just a few that have been identified when we are using this model. Now, this model is what's known as the transactional model, all right, excuse me, the transmission model. We're just transmitting. That's the first model. I am not expecting a response from this receiver. All I'm doing right now is sending the message, okay? So when I am posting my videos after the lectures, that's all it is. I'm using the transmitting or the transmission type of model, all right? I'm just going to get it out there and hope that somebody in receiver land is going to get it, okay? So that's our transmitting model. All right, so what's going to happen though is, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now on the phone? May not have a good connection. It could be people don't speak the same language. In fact, there are so many types of noise. Noise falls under the category of anything that distorts a message, anything that prevents the receiver from getting the message. It could be physical, such as static, other noises coming through, such as loud music, poor handwriting, etc. It could be physiological, such as a person who cannot see or cannot hear. It might be psychological. Oh, big one, ding, 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 ding. Take note of this one, because this one we're going to talk about a lot. Psychological noise could be biases. You may look at me and say, oh, God, she's such an old person. Oh, she's going to be so boring. And right now, kind of am, because it's just this kind of stuff. But later it gets more interesting. Okay, so you may look at me and see age and say, have a bias against age, or color of my skin, or the fact that I'm only 4'10" tall. It might be some personal experiences that you've had with me. If anybody took this class online and did terrible and now you're taking it this way, but your personal experience with me is like, ugh. Or maybe you took me in a public speaking class and your personal experience with me is awesome, and so you're taking this one. So that can skew your receiving of the message, how you interpret the message based on the psychology of you, the receiver. There could be semantic, simply means that there are different languages being spoken. I love to use semantics. I like to use the word bitch as my example of semantic. All right. There is some people will say, give me a bit. Okay, maybe not. Some people will say, you bet. Okay, good. I'm getting some snickers. All right. And some of you may say, oh, come on, let's little bitches, let's go do our thing. Okay? So there's lots of different ways. Or we might be bringing our dog, female dog, to the American Kennel Association, and it's called a bitch, which is the original denotation of the word. Okay? So depending on how I hear the use of that word is going to depend on how I'm going to interpret it, how I'm going to decode it. All right? And then there's also cultural. A lot of that happens oftentimes with nonverbal as well as verbal. So cultural examples that can get in the way are things like hand gestures. So I'm going to bring my hand out here. Don't do this outside of the United States. Don't do this outside of the United States. And the list goes on and on. Of course, you know not to use the middle finger in a special salute within the United States unless you want to send that message. Okay. So that's let me just call it the transmission model. Any questions about this model? Okay. All right. So now we're going to talk about the interaction model. And the interaction model is a little bit different. So we're going to add on some things. And it's figure 1.3. So if you go in your book to 1.3, you're going to see how we're going to add on to this. Now, the most important difference in the interaction, emphasis on inter and action, is that for this one, we are expecting or wanting or needing feedback. All right? So the receiver is going to give some type of feedback. And that feedback may be verbal or nonverbal, might be written, might be spoken, lots of different things. But there's going to be a response that is communicated to the sender. So the sender is going to know if the message was received accurately, correctly, with the intent, all of the message or just parts of the message, etc. So that feedback element is very, very important. Now, the feedback channel is going to depend on two contexts. There's the psychological, oops, spell it right. Psychological context, all right, or the physiological context. Context. Okay, context refers to the when and the where and everything of where you are. All right, so let me put this up just a little bit so that you can see. Oops. Okay, now, I've already told you what kind of psychology is going on. I've also talked to you about physiological. So the physiological is really going to be those elements such as a person's ability to hear. It could also be physical. Okay, the size of the room or the condition of the weather or something that's going on, okay? That is a contextualization of where this is occurring that enables a person to be able to either code correctly or not, right? So that's an important element there. Okay. All right, so does that make sense? So the big, I mean, this sounds like a whole lot of test questions. So the big indicator or differentiator between these two is this one is feedback, okay? All right, so now we're gonna look at the transactional model. And the transaction model is designed there on page, figure 1.4. Okay, so when we start to look at, so we've got context here and context here. Now we're going to add some additional context, okay? So the context we're going to add now are really going to focus on some critical elements. The first one at the bottom of that, it says the relationship. All right. We change our communication style depending on the relationship. So how you communicate to your parents is very different from how you communicate to your best friend. It's the relationship that you have. How you communicate with your significant other is very different from the way you communicate with a professor, all right? So that's what we mean by a relationship. And oftentimes when we're trying to understand what's working within the conversation is to look at what's the relationship that the people have with each other. All right. Now we also have here on the model they've added social. This relates a little bit to relationship, but it really is now looking almost like socioeconomic breakdown. So the social context might be supervisor to subordinate at work, or customer to employee, or it might be student to teacher, it might be President of the United States to citizen on the street, etc. So there's a lot that has to do with social status and power, okay? So when we start to talk about power differentials in communication and how people use and abuse power, that social stature is going to come into play to understand the dynamics of how people communicate. And then we have over on the other side, cultural context. As I was talking about in the first session we had, I am cisgender. That's cultural. I identify with the sex, gender of my birth. That's what cisgender means, okay? That means that culturally, I already have a difference in how I may decode information from somebody who is transsexual, all right, or another type of gender identity, okay? Another cultural differentiator is that I'm white, all right? And we talked about that on that first session. So there's a whole lot of privilege that goes with being white. Another example is that I am heterosexual, married to a male, and that I am culturally, I subscribe to this world of motherhood and now grandmotherhood, et cetera, et cetera. I'm also culturally born in the United States, and my background culturally is from Western societies or Western cultures, being of mainly Irish and English descent. Okay, so those are the things we mean by cultural. All of those factors play in to how we encode a message as well as how we decode it. Okay, you can't separate any of these. They're all a part of the complexity of communication. And then we have the psychological, the physiological, and the physical. So I'm just calling it the P's up here. Okay, context. So all of those play into the ability for a message to be able to be communicated productively, healthfully, fairly, etc. So we call that transaction. And it's the reason it's called transaction is because we have to have give and take. All right? If communication is going to be successful, we have to give and we have to take. We can't just always take, and we can't always just give. And when I talk about conflict and conflict communication, conflict management, you're going to see that there are some people who are always takers, takers, takers. And some people are always givers, givers, givers. And that's not healthy. And we'll talk about what's called transactional analysis so that you can understand that. Transactional analysis is a form or area of psychology which plays a critical important in this role, because what am I going to get out of what I give to the conversation, the message, the communication, the wants, the desires, the needs, etc. All right. The other element about transaction that's very important, so this does not have any feedback. This relies on feedback. The transactional, as it states right underneath, or actually right above the model of 1.4, says that this is simultaneously going on at the same time. This is all happening at once. Yeah, so it can be very complex. One of the ways that I like to help people understand that is if you have ever watched a basketball game, especially if you've watched any of our Flyers play basketball. It's very fast, the approach that Coach Apple uses on the basketball. And basically, what it means is that there are, at the same time, multiple players sending messages. At the same time, many receivers are getting messages from different people. Additionally, there are opponents on the other team who are sending and receiving messages to their own players. But our team is able to pick up on those at the same time, simultaneously, as our own team. Oh, by the way, then there's also dribbling, shooting, running, and hopefully not making a foul. Okay, so those are all concrete examples that illustrate, again, that this is all happening all the time, all at once. You sitting there in this classroom right now, it may feel primarily like transmission. And if you don't ask questions, there's really no interaction. There is some transaction going on because I bet some of you might be on your phones while you're listening to my lectures or even talking among yourselves or what have you. So this is what we call the models of communication, right? Now, your textbook goes into a lot of details, and I'd like to summarize by looking at the key takeaways. So it may be on page 19 in your book, but it's at the end of this section of 1.2. And basically, what I want you to recognize that communication models are simply used to try to explain the complexity of all that's going on within the communication process. And then to recognize the differences between the three models. Okay? So that's all I have for today. I will be here for the next 5 minutes to answer any follow-up questions for anybody who would like to come up and ask them. I'm going to actually turn off the recording though, so you don't have to worry about being on videotape. And if you don't have questions, you are welcome to go.